The cinematic movement known as the Iranian New Wave was one of the most important, creative, and poignant in all of film history. These films had a strong sense of realism, often focusing on women, children, or other marginalized groups. Many of them centered on poor, everyday people as opposed to the rich, important, or famous. These directors used lots of metafictional techniques and mixed documentary with fiction, sometimes blurring the lines between the two. Common themes include tradition versus modernity, gender issues, and faith. The themes were explored, but easy answers are rarely given, and the films sometimes had unresolved, ambiguous endings. There was very little violence, sex, or nudity, or even romance at all, especially in the films made after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. There was, however, plenty of political dissent, which led to censorship issues. Many Iranian New Wave filmmakers were barred from directing or even arrested, and several of them eventually left Iran. The movement was influenced by Italian neorealism, which also used non-professional actors and shot on location, but combined those traits with formal experimentation like in the French New Wave. While the influence of international art cinema is undeniable, these filmmakers also took inspiration from Persian art, literature, and poetry. The New Wave was also a reaction to film Farsi, a term for popular Iranian cinema, which was melodramatic, escapist, and unrealistic, and there were many musicals inspired by Bollywood. The movement is generally considered to consist of three waves. The first wave began in the 1960s and ended in 1979 with the revolution. One of the important precursors of the Iranian New Wave was The House is Black, directed by poet Faruga Farrokhzad. It was her only film, and sadly she died young only 4 years after this was released. The House is Black is a short black and white documentary about a leper colony, and depicts its subject in a raw, unflinching manner. She included some readings of her poems, and the medium of poetry would go on to be an important part of the New Wave. There's also some blurring of the lines between documentary and fiction, as the short contains scripted lines. The Iranian New Wave proper is usually considered to begin with director Daryush Merjoui. The seminal neorealist film Bicycle Thieves inspired him as a child, and he went on to study film at UCLA, even being taught by Jean Renoir. Merjoui's directorial career lasted from the 1960s until his final film in 2013. Merjoui's second film, The Cow, is often called the first Iranian New Wave film and brought him acclaim in Iran and internationally. It was based on an Iranian short story from a writer that was often critical of the government and had been arrested numerous times. The Cow story is about a peasant in a rural village whose only possession is a cow. The cow dies and he gradually goes insane and starts to act like a cow, chewing hay and making noises. The film presents societal critiques such as how the villager values the cow more than his own wife, a probable statement about status of women in Iran. Also, the villagers are fearful of outsiders and blame their problems on them. Stylistically, the film is quite interesting, shot in stark black and white and using slow motion, zooms, and a striking opening shot that resembles a negative image. The Cow was banned by the Ministry of Culture and Arts for about a year because it portrayed Iranians as backwards, superstitious, and impoverished, and living in a village that has no electricity or running water. It was eventually permitted to be shown domestically, but wasn't allowed to be exported, and had to be smuggled out so it could be shown at the Venice Film Festival, impressing the Italian neorealist directors that saw the film. A later major work from Merjoui is his 1975 film The Cycle, which dealt with the exploitation of the poor and marginalized. Sadly, in the wake of his recent criticism of the government, although possibly unrelated, Merjoui and his wife were stabbed to death in 2023 at their Tehran home. Another important Iranian filmmaker from the late 1960s was director Masoud Kimiai, who was mostly self-taught and didn't have academic training. His most remembered film is Kesar from 1969. The noir-influenced black and white film was a box office success and featured violence, rape, and revenge. Kesar exhibits some very interesting editing, such as in its use of intellectual montage. This is where shots are juxtaposed with imagery that is not directly part of the narrative and was pioneered by Sergei Eisenstein. Here, shots of an animal being slaughtered were edited into a scene of the main character committing a murder. Another seminal early film was Nasser Tagvai's Tranquility in the Presence of Others, which was shot in the 1960s, but only screened once and not widely shown until 1973. However, once it was released, it was well received and won the Silver Lion for Best First Work Award at the Venice Film Festival. As a pre-revolution film, it contains some sexuality and scantily clad women. It also prefigures later New Wave films in its examination of gender roles and freeze-frame ending. Director Bahram Bizai was also an important first-wave figure. He came from a family of poets, as his father, uncle, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all noted poets. Bizai was also a playwright and now lives in exile in the US. His most important film is Downpour, released in 1972. The film is a black and white romantic drama about a love triangle and the gossip and rumors that come along with it. The female lead is a single woman with a job, which was rare in Iranian film at the time. Downpour is a bold, stylish film that uses fast editing and stark contrasts. The low-budget film had no outside funding and was produced independently, which allowed them to be more creative during production, and much of it was improvised. Downpour did poorly at the box office, but received a jury prize at the first Tehran International Film Festival. Also a big part of the first wave was director Sohrab Shahid Saleh, who trained in Europe in the 1960s. He only made 2 feature films in Iran before leaving and worked in Germany after 1976. Shahid Saleh's films dealt with social realist themes in an extremely minimalist style. His first feature was A Simple Event from 1973. Unusually for this wave, but not so much in later waves, the protagonist is a 10-year-old boy in a small town living in poverty. The boy was played by a first-time actor who had never even been to a movie theater, much less starred in a film. A Simple Event is often referred to as part of the so-called slow cinema genre, which makes sense as there are lots of scenes where seemingly nothing important happens, not much dialogue or music, and it's all filmed in long takes. Shahid Saleh followed that up with Still Life, about an old man who works at a remote railway station forced to retire by the government. This film was also done in a slow cinema style, with uninterrupted long shots of the old man's routine, and scenes unfold in real time. Still Life is often seen as an exploration of monotony and time. Scenes are shown out of chronological order, with no obvious clues as to when they take place, and the railroad station manager does not know how old he is. The film is often compared to slow cinema classic Jean Dielman, which this predates by a couple years. There is no conventional music score, and the camera is often at ground level, similar to Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu. Still Life won multiple international festival awards, like the Silver Bear runner-up prize in Berlin. The final director of the first wave I'll discuss is Mohammad Reza Aslani. Before his film career, he wrote avant-garde poetry in the early 60s that was popular and influential. In 1976, he directed the feature film Chess of the Wind. It was only screened once, then not available for decades and thought to be lost, before being finally found in 2014 at a flea market in Iran. Chess of the Wind is a very unique film that feels a lot different than other Iranian New Wave films. This one is more overtly stylish, and in my opinion the most visually impressive of all of the New Wave films. The film has interesting camera movement, but also still shots, with Ozu-like low angles and framing. There are long takes throughout, and Chess of the Wind has a recorded average shot length of over 25 seconds. One of my favorite shots in the film comes about 42 minutes in, when the camera looks away from the aftermath of a murder and does a 360-degree pan set to ominous music. The over 3-minute long take at the climax is also very impressive and complex. Like so many Iranian New Wave films, it's a synthesis of foreign and domestic inspiration. There's a clear influence from European art house filmmakers like Max Ophuls, Visconti, and Bresson, as well as the Italian giallo horror, but also Iranian art, taking inspiration from specific Persian paintings, as well as the highly detailed Persian miniature art in general. There are many candlelit scenes with a painterly look, and the mansion setting gives it a gothic feel. It's also slow and quiet for much of the runtime, which makes it very atmospheric. Unlike most New Wave films, it's a period piece set in the early 1920s, right before the Pahlavi regime took power in Iran. It's also set apart by the lesbian implications that are hinted at, as it was extremely rare for even the more daring Iranian films to tackle homosexuality. A similarity with other New Wave films is the analysis of class, as it chronicles the story of an aristocratic family, but repeatedly cuts back to servants. They comment on the main plot in a way often compared to a Greek chorus, and are always shown in static long takes from a bit of a distance away and slowly zooming in. Chest of the Wind was the debut film of Shohreh Aghdashloo, who decades later became the only Iranian-born actress to get an Oscar nomination, albeit for a Hollywood movie. The second wave consists of filmmakers who made their mark in the post-revolution era of the 1980s and 90s. The war between Iran and Iraq took place during this time and is referenced often in these films. With these directors, we see a continuation of earlier trends and techniques in the Iranian New Wave, but also significant new developments. They still cast first-time actors and shot on location, but this wave is the first time we see the extensive use of metafiction and fourth-wall breaks. Director Amir Naderi's films are a perfect example of that strong neorealist influence with location shooting and first-time actors. In the 80s, he left Iran and has since made his films in the US, Italy, and Japan. His 1984 feature The Runner was the first Iranian film to get international acclaim after the revolution. The 11-year-old protagonist is an illiterate orphan who lives in an abandoned tanker and collects bottles to make money. He is based loosely on the director's own childhood, and Naderi was an orphan as well. The Runner takes place in impoverished areas and examines wealth disparity. Multiple Western brands are shown or mentioned like Coke, Fanta, and KLM. The boy seems to have a yearning to leave his homeland, and he is fascinated by the modes of transportation he sees in the distance, like planes and ships. Unhurried editing lets shots breathe, and there's lots of moving camera and tracking shots. Slow motion is used in the climax in a quite interesting way, giving the simple, small events that take place an epic, mythic feel. There are no real female characters, and women are only briefly shown. Disabled people are highlighted in several scenes, like a man with a missing leg. Naderi said he was inspired by directors like John Ford and Akira Kurosawa. Also, the film was edited by Bahram Bizai, the director of Downpour. The most acclaimed of all the Iranian New Wave directors was undoubtedly Abbas Kiarostami. He too displays a strong neorealist influence with location shooting and first-time actors, but many of his films were metafictional, self-reflexive, and blurred the lines between documentary and fiction. His trademarks include long takes, scenes in cars, and characters or other elements that are only heard and never seen. Kiarostami's films were also often ambiguous, and characters have unexplained motivations and backstories. They are humanistic and empathetic without being overly formulaic, sentimental, or maudlin. His work is philosophical, and while not necessarily overtly political, class differences were often highlighted like in so many other Iranian New Wave films. Kiarostami worked in many different creative fields, such as poetry, which is commonly quoted and referenced in his films. On top of that, he did painting, illustration, graphic design, and design credit sequences. He started directing in the 70s, but didn't get international attention until the late 80s and early 90s. Unlike a lot of the first and second wave directors, he did not leave Iran, but did make a few films in other countries. In his early short from 1981, Orderly or Disorderly, we see a hint of his future experimentation with metafiction with shots of the slate as well as Kiarostami saying sound, camera, and then cut, and we also hear him discuss the issues with making the film throughout. Where is the Friend's House, released in 1987, was the film that brought Kiarostami international recognition, and his first narrative feature since the revolution. It has a very simple, straightforward story with children as main characters. The plot consists of just a boy trying to return a notebook to his friend. The boy attempts to get help, but most of the adults aren't helpful or don't listen to him and only expect obedience from him. It mostly takes place in rural areas, set and filmed in a village named Koker that Kiarostami would return to in 2 later films. The title comes from a poem, and Kiarostami consistently referenced poetry throughout his career. The film also features a zigzag path that would become a Kiarostami trademark. Where is the Friend's House was highly praised by none other than Akira Kurosawa, who called it one of his favorites. A turning point in both Kiarostami's style and the Iranian New Wave in general came in 1990 with Close Up. This is where he goes deep into metafiction, with a film about a man who pretended to be the acclaimed Iranian director Samira Makhmalbaf before being caught and put on trial for it. Close Up is a true story, and the man who committed the fraud plays himself in the film. Many real events are reenacted, and the family that was fooled and Makhmalbaf all play themselves as well. Other metafictional touches we get are shots of clapboards and Kiarostami explaining the lenses he will be using in the courtroom scene. In addition, the sound cuts out at the end, which is ostensibly due to technical issues that did not really happen, and was just an artistic choice by Kiarostami because he didn't think what Makhmalbaf was saying at the end was authentic enough. The film does not explicitly inform the viewers as to which parts are recreations and which parts are real, leaving that for the audience to puzzle out. On top of all that, Kiarostami plays with and subverts audience expectations in other ways, such as when the soldiers go to arrest the imposter Sabzian, instead of following them inside, we stay outside and listen to conversations that have nothing to do with the plot between minor characters. And then in one of the most discussed scenes of the film, we watch an aerosol can roll down a street for quite some time. Many have speculated and gave some sort of symbolic meaning to the rolling can, but Kiarostami himself described the scene as nothing. He stated that he added these types of scenes to allow the audience to complete the film in their minds. Then we follow the reporter for a while as he searches for a tape recorder, even though he becomes irrelevant as the film goes on. We don't see the scene of Sabzian being arrested until much later, and the film is edited into a non-linear chronology. Supposedly, the film's chronology is partly the result of the reels getting mixed up at a film festival and Kiarostami preferring the way it ended up. While this may sound like an exercise in formalism, at the heart of it all is a story about reconciliation and empathy. Thematically, Close Up tackles the issue of class. Sabzian is poor, pretended to be a well-off director, and tricked an upper-class family. But he seemed to not do it out of malice, but rather for the respect he felt he lacked in real life. Kiarostami didn't usually use a lot of music in his films, and here there is none until the ending. Close Up also has a freeze-frame ending, which became a common trope in Iranian New Wave films. It got negative reviews in Iran, but was very well received internationally, so much so that it's often credited with bringing Iranian cinema to the attention of global cinephiles. And Close Up was the first major metafictional film to come from the Iranian New Wave. Kiarostami continued this postmodern trend with the self-referential And Life Goes On, released in 1992. In 1990, an earthquake hit an area in northwestern Iran that contained Kokr, the village that Where's the Friend's House was largely filmed in. Kiarostami went to Kokr to find the actors from that film, and that inspired And Life Goes On. There are Kiarostami trademarks such as car scenes, people asking for directions, and zigzagging paths. It's metafictional in that it references a previous Kiarostami film and is based on his experiences, but the fourth wall remains intact the entire time. 2 years later, Kiarostami completed what has been dubbed the Kokr trilogy with Through the Olive Trees. It begins with the actor who plays a director talking directly to the camera, and this is the first time this technique was deployed in one of his narrative films. Through the Olive Trees is extremely metafictional, as we get close-ups on the clapboard, and the whole thing is about making a movie. Kiarostami himself appears, as well as other crew members such as assistant director Jafar Panahi, whose directorial career I'll discuss later in the video. The film includes a long take with the camera mounted on a vehicle as it drives down a road, which is a callback to a similar shot in And Life Goes On. And in typical Kiarostami style, there are other conversations in a car shot in his usual way, where we see one person or the other. And it ends with a zigzag path that was a Kiarostami trademark as well. Possibly Kiarostami's most powerful film was the 1997 Palme d'Or winner Taste of Cherry. It's about a man who drives around looking for someone to help him commit suicide. His reasons or backstory are never given, and he seems to be healthy and financially well off. The film was banned in Iran for encouraging suicide, even though that certainly doesn't seem like the intent of the film. Basically, the entire movie is a car ride, and at times we get shots of the car from a distance, while we hear the conversation as if it is right next to us. This contradiction between the image and sound is something Kiarostami explored throughout his career. One of the people our protagonist interacts with is a Kurdish soldier. The Kurds are an ethnic group that live in Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, and have been oppressed and discriminated against for over a century, and they are commonly featured in Iranian New Wave films. The film also takes place all in one day, and more films I'll discuss later in the video similarly are set over a very short span of time. It's also a simple, straightforward story with no subplots, but there are plenty of deep philosophical conversations about things such as the morality of suicide. Taste of Cherry has a meta conclusion, and like Close Up, no soundtrack until the very end. Kiarostami followed that up with The Wind Will Carry Us, another meta work about filmmakers. Poetry is very important to this one, as a character recites an Omar Khayyam poem, and the title is a reference to a poem by the director of The House is Black. The main character is a filmmaker, and his assistants are off-screen characters that are only heard and never shown. The Wind Will Carry Us is a bit more comedic than usual for Kiarostami, partly due to the filmmaker's antics when he goes all over the place trying to get reception on his phone. This one involves the Kurds again, as the filmmaker is making a documentary on Kurdish funerals. In his 2001 documentary ABC Africa, Kiarostami shot on digital for the first time. It was also his first film shot outside of Iran. The year after that saw the release of the film 10. Kiarostami got even more experimental with this film, but sadly it's impossible to talk about it without discussing the serious accusations leveled by the lead actress Mania Akbari towards Kiarostami. Most seriously, in 2022, she accused Kiarostami of raping her. She also stated that he committed plagiarism and that the film was actually hers. The entire film was shot with locked-off digital cameras in a car in a different style from Kiarostami's previous feature films. The film consists of 10 long takes, hence the title. However, Akbari claimed that these scenes were entirely created by her as a non-fiction personal project without Kiarostami's involvement. Kiarostami stated he was sitting in the back of the car at times, and another actor in the film stated that Kiarostami was involved. Their stories of the film's production are completely irreconcilable. Also, 10 was banned in Iran due to discussion of women's rights and the inclusion of a sex worker. Regardless of the true origins of 10, it marked a turning point in Kiarostami's style. This artistic shift continued with his most experimental and abstract film, 5 dedicated to Ozu, with the title referencing the previously mentioned Japanese director. The film has no dialogue at all, and most of it doesn't even depict humans. It was shot digitally and is solely made up of 5 long takes, mostly with a locked-off camera as Ozu almost always used. In 2008, Kiarostami released Shireen, his most unique film. It consists almost entirely of close-ups on women's faces while they ostensibly watch a movie that we only hear and never see. The women are mostly well-known Iranian actresses, but the Oscar-winning French actress Juliette Binoche also appears. The actresses weren't actually watching anything, and Kiarostami only came up with the concept after all the footage was shot. The conceit of people watching a film that doesn't actually exist reminds me of postmodern novels about non-existent works, like House of Leaves, Infinite Jest, and Nabokov's Pale Fire. Following that, Kiarostami directed Certified Copy, his first fictional film made outside of Iran and not in Farsi. He reunites with Binoche, and here she is the rare example of a professional actor playing the lead role in one of his films. In typical Kiarostami style, there's an extended sequence of a conversation in a car between the two main characters. Another Kiarostami trademark is all the philosophical dialogues, here mostly about authenticity and originality. And despite the lack of Iranian characters or settings, he also manages to throw in a reference to a Persian poem. Kiarostami passed away in 2016, and his final film, 24 Frames, was released posthumously a year later. Another important director of the second wave is Mohsen Makhmalbaf, the director at the center of Kiarostami's close-up. Makhmalbaf has an interesting story as he started out his career as a radical Muslim, and his early films were more religious and fit in with the government's orthodoxy. However, later in his career, his work became less dogmatic, and many of his films were banned in Iran. In the 90s, his films started appearing at international film festivals such as Cannes. His most acclaimed work is A Moment of Innocence from 1996, a metafictional film inspired by his experience with Kiarostami. The story behind the film is fascinating and possibly the most audacious example of Iranian metafiction. As a teenager, Makhmalbaf stabbed a police officer at a protest who worked for the Shah's regime in pre-revolutionary Iran, and he then spent 5 years in prison for the attack. Decades later, after the revolution, Makhmalbaf met the officer when he showed up for an open audition, at least according to some sources, and the film is about them collaborating on a reenactment of this event. Some critics have claimed that the actor is not the real policeman that was stabbed, but I can't find 100% confirmation either way. We see them casting and directing the actors, and in typical Iranian New Wave style, most of the cast is first-time actors. Like Close-Up, it plays with the concept of an objective view of the past, and it's not always clear how much of the film is scripted and how much was unplanned. Both films also have a nonlinear chronology. The film is metafictional on many levels, such as showing the clapboard like in the Kiarostami films mentioned earlier. Also, like in Close-Up, the film ends on a freeze frame, a technique that has long been rendered a cliché in American cinema, but is still poignant and meaningful here. There's also metatextuality in the references to famous film figures such as Sophia Loren and John Ford. A Moment of Innocence was banned for about a year in Iran for taking a critical look at the revolution and its aftermath. Makhmalbaf also released the film Gaba in 1996, which screened at Cannes and was unusual among New Wave films due to its fantasy elements. Makhmalbaf left Iran in 2005 and has been living in France ever since. The final second wave director I'll cover is Majid Majidi, whose films show the resilience of everyday people, often children, against adversity, and address themes of faith and nature. Majidi's films aren't metafictional, are told linearly, and he doesn't play with chronology like other Iranian New Wave directors. His work is more straightforward and less cerebral than directors like Kiarostami or Makhmalbaf. Majidi's 1997 film Children of Heaven was the first Iranian film nominated for the Best Foreign Film Oscar, but lost to Life is Beautiful. Like many Iranian New Wave films, it has a simple story about a boy who loses his sister's shoes and their attempts to deal with this problem. This may seem like a trivial issue to Westerners, but to these impoverished children, it's a huge deal. The boy enters a foot race in order to win a pair of shoes as a prize, and in a climax similar to The Runner, slow motion is employed to give the children's race an epic feel. Class differences are touched on, such as in the part where the boy's father is ashamed of how he might sound over the intercom when conversing with wealthy people. In The Color of Paradise, Majidi again built his film around a child, this time a blind boy, portrayed by a blind actor. The film deals with philosophical and religious themes as the child questions the harsh society he lives in, as well as the existence of God. Majidi again uses slow motion to powerful effect in the climax. And finally, the third wave is made up of directors whose careers began in the late 1990s and 2000s. A major example is Jafar Panahi, who collaborated extensively with Kiarostami. His style has similarities like the use of metafiction and non-professional actors, but Panahi is more political than philosophical. He focused on everyday people in urban settings, like in his debut film The White Balloon from 1995. It tells a very simple story about children with no antagonist, unless you count the sidewalk grate that their money fell into, which they spend the entire film trying to retrieve. The White Balloon was co-written by Kiarostami and has a similar feel to Where's the Friend's House. Fitting in with the straightforward nature of the story, the film is told in real time, and this is a technique Panahi would use often in his career. This was one of Panahi's few films that was shown freely in Iran, and reportedly directors there can get away with more if they're about children. 2 years later, Panahi directed The Mirror, which told a very similar story to The White Balloon, but with a major twist. It's also about a little girl trying to accomplish something and has no antagonist. The Mirror starts with a panning 360-degree shot that lasts over 3 minutes, and Panahi opts for long takes throughout its runtime. The film pulls the rug out from underneath us with a mind-bending fourth wall break halfway through. The film is suddenly thrust into a deeper level of reality, and instead of a temporary detour, this is our reality for the rest of the film. We see the camera crew, and the film switches to grainier 16mm with handheld camera. The framing changes, and the audience can't even see the protagonist in a good amount of these shots as she's blocked by cars. Furthermore, the sound starts to break up just like in the climax of Close-Up. Since this is an Iranian New Wave film, of course what is or isn't real is never explicitly spelled out, and the viewer is left wondering if the second half was real or if that was scripted too. Panahi followed The Mirror with The Circle, which revolves on women and their societal oppression, so unsurprisingly it was banned in Iran. It has 3 separate stories, all with their own visual style, ranging from handheld camera to more steady dolly shots, and won prizes at film festivals such as the Golden Lion at Venice. In 2003, he directed Crimson Gold, which was again written by Abbas Kiarostami. This one was also not shown in Iranian theaters, which is hardly surprising given the bleak, disturbing content. The main character, Hossein, delivers pizzas for a living and was played by a first-time actor, who was actually himself a schizophrenic pizza delivery person. His performance is unexpressive and sedate, but his condition is never mentioned in the film. Crimson Gold comments on wealth inequality, with the protagonist at one point hanging out with a wealthy man that spends frivolously and has a carefree life living in an expensive apartment his parents own. Meanwhile, Hossein served in the Iran-Iraq War and lives a difficult life of crime and low-paying jobs. Like Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf before him, Panahi uses non-linear chronology, and the film starts with the suicide of Hossein. The opening scene is a locked-off shot of a robbery, with the camera not following the action, allowing the rare bit of violence in this era of the New Wave to take place off-screen. Later, the film switches to handheld camera, tracking shots, and POV shots. After Crimson Gold, Panahi surreptitiously made a film called Offside, criticizing Iranian sexism. He claimed he was making a film about men trying to watch a soccer game, but actually made one about women, who were barred from attending matches in Iran. Then, in 2010, Panahi was arrested for making a documentary on protests following the election. His punishment involved a 20-year ban on filmmaking, so he skirted the rules for a documentary titled This Is Not a Film, about Panahi himself during his house arrest. The title is likely a reference to Magritte's self-reflexive Treachery of Images painting that states "This is not a pipe" above a painting of a pipe. In the documentary, Panahi discusses the script he wrote for a film he is not allowed to make. It scrutinizes Iranian sexism and is about a woman who is not allowed to go to college by her parents, locked up at home like Panahi. He acts out the script and outlines the sets on the floor using tape. Given the circumstances, he had to smuggle out the footage on a USB drive hidden in a cake. Panahi directed 2 more films illegally, like Taxi, where he gives people rides around Tehran. A lesser-known director of the third wave is Bahman Gobadi. He gives a spotlight to marginalized people such as the Kurds, and as it basically goes without saying at this point, cast non-professional actors. Gobadi's 2000 film A Time for Drunken Horses was the co-winner of the Camera d'Or Award at Cannes, which is given out for the best first feature film. About Kurds and in Kurdish, it's set in Gobadi's native village, and the first film in Kurdish to get international recognition. The main characters are children, and one of them is handicapped and needs surgery. In order to raise money, they resort to attempting to smuggle tires over the border of Iran and Iraq. A Time for Drunken Horses has a documentary-like feel, with the pervasive use of handheld camera. In 2009, Gobadi directed No One Knows About Persian Cats, which is about underground Iranian musicians, and the film is basically a series of music videos strung together by a loose plot. There's a wide variety of genres, from electronic to hip-hop to metal. This one is a lot different than the other Iranian New Wave films. It's way louder and more energetic, at times even rapidly edited, not contemplative or meandering. However, Persian Cats does mix documentary and fiction, with people playing themselves in scripted scenes based on reality, and it's self-reflexive, acknowledging its own production on screen. Also beginning her career around the turn of the millennium was Samira Makhmalbaf, daughter of director Mohsen discussed earlier. Like Gobadi, she too made films highlighting the plight of marginalized communities. She wrote and directed her debut feature The Apple at age 17, and impressively for such a young filmmaker, it was screened at Cannes. Makhmalbaf's film tells the sad story of 12-year-old twin sisters that were confined for their entire lives and kept away from any sort of social interaction. Their impoverished fundamentalist father didn't allow them to see the sun or even bathe. The twins play themselves, and surprisingly so does the father, who wanted the chance to tell his side of the story. Like A Time for Drunken Horses, her follow-up Blackboards was about Kurds and in Kurdish. It was set in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War and gives us a story of Kurdish teachers that are trying to find students near the border. Blackboards emphasizes the great danger that the Kurds were in, and like in Gobadi's film, some have to resort to smuggling. Also like Gobadi's film, Blackboards contains quite a bit of handheld camera. Like The Apple, this too screened at Cannes and even won a jury prize. After the fall of the Taliban in 2001, Makhmalbaf directed 2 features that were shot in Afghanistan. Possibly the most acclaimed director of the third wave, Asghar Farhadi, has had 2 films that won the Best Foreign Film Award at the Oscars. His films are more plot-driven and less experimental than a lot of others from the Iranian New Wave. They aren't really metafictional, and Farhadi mostly casts professionals, but like much of the New Wave, have a social realist style and spotlight everyday people. Farhadi's debut feature came out in 2003, but he started to receive international recognition in 2009 with his film About Ellie. It won the Best Director award at the Berlin Film Festival and was Iran's submission to the Academy Awards. About Ellie has a brisker pace than a lot of the Iranian New Wave, and while the plot is certainly given room to breathe, we don't get long silences or follow a can as it rolls down a street. The film does have other stylistic similarities to other New Wave films, such as a lot of moving camera work with tracking and POV shots and handheld camera, as well as a lack of music until the end credits. Unlike many New Wave directors, Farhadi does not center this film on the impoverished, and instead the characters are all middle class and cosmopolitan. There's also more of an emphasis on suspense and tension than in many of the more contemplative New Wave movies. Gender issues are touched on, such as how characters have to claim to be married in order to allow a man and a woman to stay in the same place, or when one of the characters is subject to abuse from her husband. The film makes it clear that even urbanites are not immune from sexism. Farhadi's next film, A Separation, was the first Iranian film to win the Best Foreign Film Award at the Oscars, and the first to win Best Film at the Berlin Film Festival. It also got an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay, which is rare for a non-English film. Like About Ellie, it touches on gender issues, as plot points include a woman that cannot leave the country without her husband's permission, and another that struggles with the morality of coming into close physical proximity with an older man she's trying to care for. Class is also important here, as we see the differences between the two couples in the film. One has more money and is more secular, while the lower class couple is deeply religious. The cast features actors returning from About Ellie, and Farhadi also cast his daughter in a major role. Stylistically, the film also has similarities to About Ellie, like the use of handheld camera. Like so many Iranian directors, Farhadi had to fight censorship in order to make this, as he was temporarily banned from filmmaking, and was only allowed to do so after apologizing for a controversial award acceptance speech. The film was praised by many American filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, Woody Allen, and David Fincher. 5 years later, Farhadi directed The Salesman, which again won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film, as well as Best Screenplay and Best Actor at Cannes. It's the main example of something in the vein of metafiction for Farhadi, as it's about a production of the Arthur Miller play Death of a Salesman, and the boundaries between reality and fiction are blurred, but the metafiction is not as explicit as other New Wave films. The influence of the Iranian New Wave on filmmaking as a whole is undeniable. Many of the greatest directors have acknowledged the movement as inspiration, including Martin Scorsese, Werner Herzog, Pedro Almodovar, and Lars von Trier. While current Iranian directors aren't referred to as part of the New Wave, and there doesn't seem to be a fourth wave of the movement, its legacy lives on in the country. We can see this in films like the Oscar-nominated The Seed of the Sacred Fig, as it mixes documentary with narrative with the incorporation of real footage from protests. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and please check out my Patreon, which I will link to in the description. If you have any suggestions for other film movements or countries to cover, let me know in the comments.